You're scrolling through motivational content again. Another video promising to ignite your fire, another quote telling you that you can do it. Another speech designed to pump you up for the challenge ahead. And for a few minutes, maybe even a few hours, you feel that surge, that energy, that sense that yes, this time it's going to be different. But then the feeling fades. The motivation drains away like water through your fingers, and you're back where you started, reaching for the next hit of inspiration, the next dose of encouragement, the next external force to push you toward action. You've become an addict, but what you're addicted to is the feeling of wanting to act rather than the act itself. And here's what nobody tells you. What you're starting to suspect, but are terrified to admit. The more motivation you need, the further you are from actually doing anything. Every motivational video you watch, every inspiring quote you save, every pump-up speech you listen to is evidence of a deeper problem. You're outsourcing your will. You're waiting for something outside yourself to give you permission to become who you're supposed to be. You've turned into someone who needs to be convinced to live your own life, who requires external persuasion to pursue your own goals, who can only move when pushed by forces you don't control. And you know what the worst part is? You've probably noticed that the people who are actually doing things, the people who are actually creating, actually building, actually transforming their lives, they're not the ones consuming motivational content. They're not the ones waiting for inspiration to strike. They're not the ones who need to be pumped up before they can take action. They're just moving day after day, whether they feel like it or not, whether anyone is cheering them on or not, whether the motivation is there or not. And that difference, that fundamental difference in how they relate to action is what separates them from you. You're not lazy. That's not the problem. The problem is so much deeper and so much more disturbing than laziness. What Nietzsche discovered, what he spent years analyzing in himself and others, what he warned about with increasing urgency as his work developed, is that the need for motivation is a symptom of a specific kind of spiritual sickness. It's the mark of someone who has become separated from their own will, disconnected from their own power, alienated from their own life force. And until you understand what Nietzsche understood about this condition, you'll keep cycling through the same pattern, consuming motivation, feeling temporarily energized, watching it fade, seeking more motivation over and over until you die, having never actually lived. Today, I'm going to show you exactly what Nietzsche discovered about why needing motivation means you've already lost the game. And more importantly, how to reconnect with a source of authentic action that exists beneath all the psychological tricks and external cheerleading. By the end of this video, you'll understand not just why you need constant motivation, but you'll see the specific mechanism that traps you in this dependency, and you'll have the map Nietzsche left for breaking free from it. And most crucially, you'll discover that what you think is your greatest weakness, this inability to stay motivated, might actually be your psyche trying to tell you something desperately important about the life you're trying to force yourself to live. Stay with me, because what I'm about to reveal will either destroy your entire approach to self-improvement or liberate you from the prison you've been building one motivational video at a time. Consider the case of Nietzsche himself in 1882, working on Thus Spoke Zarathustra. He was living in the Italian Riviera, sick, isolated, surviving on a small pension, with almost no readers for the books he'd already published. By any external measure, he had every reason to need motivation. No audience, no recognition, failing health, no promise that his work would ever matter to anyone. And yet, during this period, he entered what he described as a state of creative possession so intense that he wrote the first part of Zarathustra in just 10 days. He didn't need motivational speeches. He didn't need to pump himself up. He didn't need external validation or encouragement. Something in him was simply expressing itself, and no force in the world could have stopped it. In his notebooks from this period, Nietzsche describes the experience in terms that sound almost frightening. He writes about ideas that attacked him, that seized him, that demanded to be written. Not ideas he had to force himself to engage with. Not ideas he needed motivation to explore. Ideas that possessed him so completely that writing became not something he chose to do, but something that happened through him. And here's the crucial insight. This wasn't because Nietzsche was naturally disciplined or exceptionally motivated. It was because he had reached a state where what he was doing and who he was had become the same thing. There was no gap between his essential nature and his creative work, which meant there was no resistance requiring motivation to overcome. What Nietzsche understood, what he spent his entire philosophical career trying to articulate, is that the human being in their natural state is not a creature that requires external motivation to act. Look at a child before they've been conditioned, before they've been trained, before they've internalized all the shoulds and musts and have-tos. They don't need motivation to play, to explore, to create, to express themselves. They're overflowing with spontaneous action, with natural curiosity, with unforced engagement with life. The motivation is built in. It's intrinsic. It's what they are rather than something they need to acquire from outside. But then something happens. The child gets socialized. They learn that their natural impulses are often wrong, inappropriate, unacceptable. They learn to separate what they want to do from what they should do. They internalize a whole system of externally imposed values, goals, ambitions, definitions of success, and gradually, inevitably, they become split. Part of them wants one thing, another part insists they should want something else. Part of them moves in one direction, another part pulls them toward a different direction, and the gap between these parts, that internal division, that's where the need for motivation enters. Nietzsche calls this condition the sickness of the will. In the genealogy of morals, he traces how it develops, how human beings become turned against themselves, how we learn to experience our own natural impulses as obstacles to overcome rather than expressions to embody. The need for motivation, from Nietzsche's perspective, is not evidence that you're not trying hard enough. It's evidence that you're trying to force yourself to do something that's fundamentally at odds with who you actually are. It's evidence that you've internalized goals that aren't genuinely yours, values that don't actually resonate with your deeper nature, ambitions that were implanted rather than grown organically from your own soil. Think about when you actually need motivation. Is it for things that genuinely excite you, that genuinely call to you, that genuinely feel like expressions of who you are? Or is it for things you think you should be doing, things you've been told will make you successful, things that fit the template of what a good life is supposed to look like? When you're doing something that's truly aligned with your nature, you don't need motivation. You need restraint. You need to force yourself to stop, to sleep, to eat, because the activity itself generates energy rather than depleting it. The need for motivation is the symptom. The disease is living a life that requires you to constantly override your own nature to maintain it. Nietzsche identified 3 distinct types of motivation seekers, and recognizing which type you are is crucial for understanding how trapped you've become and what it will take to break free. The first type he calls the slave who dreams of rebellion. This is the person who knows, achisami level, that they're living according to values and pursuing goals that were imposed on them from outside. They can feel the inauthenticity of their life. They sense that they're following a script written by parents, culture, society, the market, but they're terrified of actually breaking free, actually questioning those inherited values, actually risking the security and approval that comes from conforming. So instead, they consume motivation, lots of it. They watch videos about crushing it, about being a warrior, about unleashing their beast mode. They post quotes about never giving up and grinding harder. They perform a kind of psychological theater where they pretend to be rebelling, pretend to be taking radical action, pretend to be living on their own terms. But look closely at what they're actually doing. They're working harder at the job. They hate to climb a ladder they don't actually want to climb. They're forcing themselves to pursue goals they don't genuinely care about with greater intensity and discipline. The motivation lets them feel like rebels while remaining slaves. Nietzsche saw this pattern everywhere in the emerging self-help culture of his time, and it's become infinitely worse in ours. The entire motivational industry exists to help people become better slaves. More productive slaves, more disciplined slaves, more optimized slaves, but slaves nonetheless. Because the fundamental question is never asked, should you be doing this at all? Is this goal actually worth pursuing? Does this ambition actually reflect your authentic nature, or is it something you've been conditioned to want? The motivation obscures that question, drowns it out with noise and energy and the feeling of forward motion, even when you're running in circles inside a cage. The second type Nietzsche identifies is what he calls the last man, though this applies to any gender. This is the person who has become so domesticated, so comfortable, so adapted to a life of minimal risk and maximum security that they've lost touch with any authentic desire. They don't even know what they genuinely want anymore because they've spent so long training themselves to want only what's safe, achievable, socially acceptable. These people need motivation for everything because nothing generates intrinsic energy for them. They need to be motivated to exercise, motivated to work, motivated to pursue relationships, motivated to have hobbies, motivated to do literally anything that isn't passive consumption. The last man, Nietzsche writes in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, has made everything small. They've reduced life to comfort, security, entertainment. They've eliminated all the sharp edges, all the real stakes, all the genuine danger that makes life feel alive. And then they wonder why they need constant motivation to do basic things. It's because they've created a life so devoid of real meaning, real challenge, real risk, that their psyche has gone to sleep. The motivation they seek is trying to artificially stimulate something that can only arise naturally from engagement with life at full intensity. What makes this type particularly tragic is that they often know something is wrong. They feel the deadness, the numbness, the sense that they're just going through motions. But their solution is always to find better motivation, more effective motivation, more powerful techniques for generating enthusiasm. They never consider that maybe the problem is the life they've built. That maybe the solution isn't to feel more enthusiastic about their comfortable routine, but to smash the routine and risk something real. That would be too frightening, too destabilizing, too dangerous. Better to keep seeking motivation for the safe life than to live a dangerous life that doesn't require motivation. The third type Nietzsche describes is the most interesting and the most relevant to anyone seriously engaged with self-development. He calls them the frustrated creators. These are people who actually have genuine creative impulses, authentic desires, real potential for originality, but they've been conditioned to believe that their natural way of operating is wrong, undisciplined, insufficient. They've absorbed the message that real achievement requires grinding, forcing, pushing through resistance. They've learned to distrust their own organic rhythm and try to impose someone else's rhythm on themselves. So they consume enormous amounts of motivational content, not because they lack drive, but because they're trying to drive themselves in ways that violate their nature. They're trying to be productive on someone else's schedule, creative in someone else's format, successful according to someone else's metrics. And because this requires constantly overriding their own instincts, they need constant motivation to maintain the override. The motivation becomes the whip they use to beat themselves into conformity with an ideal of productivity or discipline or consistency that has nothing to do with how they actually function best. Nietzsche experienced this himself in his academic career. He tried to be a traditional scholar, producing the kind of meticulous, footnoted, careful work that the university system rewarded, and he was miserable. He needed enormous motivation to force himself to work in that mode because it was fundamentally misaligned with his nature. Once he broke free from academia, once he started writing in his own way, following his own rhythm, creating in forms that felt natural to him, the need for external motivation disappeared. The work itself became the motivation because it was finally an authentic expression rather than a forced performance. I know what I just said might have hit hard, and I want you to stop for a second and feel if this resonates with you. Do you find yourself constantly seeking motivation? Do you need to pump yourself up before you can take action? Do you cycle through inspiration and depletion over and over, never quite able to sustain the energy you need to make real progress? If yes, you're not alone in this pattern. I know exactly what it's like to feel that gap between what you know you should do and what you actually feel capable of doing. It's not weakness. It's not laziness. It's a sign that something fundamental is misaligned. Leave a comment saying, "I'm tired of needing motivation." Your comment will make someone else feel less alone in their struggle with this. By sharing this, you'll help someone who needs to know that the problem isn't their lack of willpower, but something deeper in how they've been conditioned to relate to action and achievement. Now, here are the specific dangers Nietzsche warned about when it comes to the motivation trap. And these dangers are so subtle that most people caught in them never recognize what's happening until years have been wasted. Danger number one is what Nietzsche calls the weakening of the will through exercise. This sounds counterintuitive because the entire motivational paradigm is built on the idea that willpower is like a muscle that gets stronger with use. But Nietzsche observed something very different in people who are constantly forcing themselves to act through motivation rather than natural drive. Each time you override your resistance through external motivation rather than resolving the internal misalignment that's creating the resistance, you reinforce the pattern of dependency. You teach yourself that action requires external stimulus. You train yourself to wait for the hit of inspiration before you can move. Think about what actually happens when you watch a motivational video and then take action. You get a temporary surge of energy that pushes you past your resistance. But the resistance is still there. You haven't addressed it, understood it, resolved it. You've just temporarily overpowered it. And the next time you need to take action, the resistance is still there, often stronger because now it knows what's coming. So you need more motivation, a bigger hit, a stronger stimulus to generate enough force to override it. You've created an addiction cycle where you need increasing doses to achieve the same effect. Nietzsche argues that each time you do this, you're actually weakening your will rather than strengthening it. You're teaching your psyche that you can't act on your own, that you need outside forces to move you, that you're not capable of self-generated action. The will becomes dependent, reactive, waiting to be moved rather than moving itself. And this dependency grows stronger the more you rely on motivation, until you reach a point where you literally cannot take action without external stimulus. You've become a puppet that requires someone else to pull the strings. Danger number 2 is what Nietzsche identifies as the corruption of authentic desire. This is more insidious than the first danger because it happens so gradually that you don't notice it's occurring. When you constantly consume motivational content about specific goals, when you immerse yourself in narratives about what success looks like and what you should be striving for, you start to confuse manufactured desire with authentic desire. The goals start to feel like they're yours when they're actually implanted, borrowed, adopted from the culture around you. Nietzsche observed this particularly in relation to what he called the ascetic ideal, the cultural narrative that says you should deny yourself pleasure, sacrifice for the future. Discipline your natural impulses in service of some higher goal. Motivational content is saturated with this ideal. It's all about overcoming your weakness, conquering your laziness, forcing yourself to do hard things. And while this narrative sounds empowering, what it actually does is install a value system where your natural inclinations are positioned as the enemy in some externally defined version of success is positioned as the goal worth any sacrifice. The danger is that you can spend decades pursuing goals that seem like yours, that you've motivated yourself to work toward, that you've disciplined yourself to achieve, only to realize when you finally reach them that they were never what you actually wanted. They were what you were told to want, what you learned to want, what you convinced yourself you wanted through exposure to narratives about what a successful life looks like. And by the time you realize this, you've often sacrificed the things that did authentically call to you, the paths that did genuinely resonate with your nature, the possibilities that you dismissed as impractical or insufficiently ambitious. Danger number 3 is what Nietzsche calls the atrophy of instinct. Human beings are born with remarkable instinctive capacities. We have built-in sense of rhythm, natural patterns of energy and rest, intuitive understanding of what our body and psyche need in different situations. Young children demonstrate this constantly. They know when they're hungry and when they're full. They know when they need to move and when they need to be still. They know what interests them and what doesn't. This instinctive wisdom is incredibly sophisticated when it's allowed to function naturally, but the motivation paradigm trains you to override these instincts. You learn to eat according to a plan rather than according to hunger. You learn to work according to a schedule rather than according to your natural rhythm. You learn to push through fatigue rather than rest when your body asks for rest. You learn to force focus when your attention wants to wander. And gradually, inevitably, your instincts atrophy. You lose the ability to sense what you genuinely need because you've spent so long overriding those signals in favor of externally imposed regimens. Nietzsche saw this as one of the great tragedies of modern civilization, the systematic destruction of human instinct in the name of productivity and discipline. People become disconnected from their own bodies, their own rhythms, their own natural intelligence. And then, ironically, they need motivation to do basic things like sleep enough, or exercise, or eat well because they've lost the instinctive connection to these activities. They have to be convinced to take care of themselves because their instincts have been trained into silence. Danger number 4 is perhaps the most damaging in terms of your actual capacity to accomplish significant things. Nietzsche calls it the substitution of excitation for creation. This happens when you become so addicted to the feeling of being motivated, the surge of energy and enthusiasm and possibility, that you start consuming motivation as an end in itself rather than as a means to action. You get hooked on the emotional experience of feeling inspired, feeling capable, feeling like you're about to do something amazing, and that feeling becomes a substitute for actually doing the thing. You've probably experienced this. You watch a motivational video and feel amazing. You're pumped, you're ready, you're convinced that this time everything is going to change. And for the next hour or two, or maybe even a day, you ride that high. You feel like a person who's capable of great things, and then the feeling fades, and instead of actually doing the work, you go find another source of that feeling. Another video, another speech, another hit of inspiration. You're not actually creating or building or transforming anything. You're just cycling through emotional states, getting high on the fantasy of action without ever actually acting. Nietzsche observed this pattern in what he called the armchair revolutionaries of his time. People who consumed ideas about radical change, who got excited about philosophical breakthroughs, who talked endlessly about transformation but never actually transformed anything. They were addicted to the feeling of being on the verge of something significant without ever stepping over that verge into actual significance. The motivation became the drug. And like any drug, it provided temporary pleasure while preventing the real work that would actually change their circumstances. The tragedy is that the energy you waste on this cycle, the time you spend consuming and getting excited and coming down and seeking the next hit, that energy and time could be directed toward actual creation. But you never get there because you're trapped in the preparation phase, the getting ready phase, the psyching yourself up phase. You mistake the pregame for the game itself, and years can pass this way. Years of feeling like you're always just about to start living, always just about to make your move, always just on the verge of becoming who you're meant to be without ever actually becoming it. So how do you break free from this trap? How do you move from someone who needs constant motivation to someone who acts from authentic internal drive? Nietzsche didn't just diagnose the problem. He mapped out what he called the path of the sovereign individual. The developmental journey from dependency on external motivation to what he calls the will to power. The capacity to act from your own nature without needing outside forces to move you. Phase 1 of this path, Nietzsche calls the recognition of slavery. This is when you finally admit to yourself with complete honesty that most of what you're doing, most of what you think you want, most of the goals you're pursuing, they're not actually yours. They were given to you, implanted in you, conditioned into you. And the reason you need constant motivation is because some part of you knows this and is resisting. Not out of weakness or laziness, but out of wisdom, out of self-preservation, out of refusal to waste your life on someone else's agenda. This recognition is brutal because it means looking at your life and acknowledging how much of it has been spent trying to become someone you're not. Trying to want things you don't actually want. Trying to succeed according to definitions of success that don't resonate with your actual nature. It means admitting that all the motivation you've consumed, all the discipline you've tried to develop, all the grinding and forcing and pushing yourself, it was in service of a project that was fundamentally misguided from the start. That's a hard thing to face. Most people never face it. They keep consuming motivation until they die, wondering why it never quite worked, why the transformation never quite happened. But if you can face it, if you can sit with the uncomfortable truth that you've been trying to live someone else's life, something remarkable becomes possible. You can stop. You can let go of goals that never were yours. You can release ambitions that were never authentic. And in that release, in that radical letting go, space opens up for something else to emerge. Not something you have to force into being. Something that's already there, waiting beneath all the conditioning, all the inherited values you've been carrying. Phase 2 is what Nietzsche calls the discovery of authentic desire. This is harder than it sounds because you've probably spent years, maybe decades, training yourself not to pay attention to your authentic desires. You've learned to dismiss them as impractical, unrealistic, selfish, childish. You've learned to prioritize what you should want over what you actually want. And now you have to reverse that conditioning. Relearn how to sense what genuinely calls to you as opposed to what you've been told should call to you. Nietzsche suggests a specific practice for this, though he doesn't frame it as a practice. He talks about paying attention to where your attention naturally goes when it's not being directed. What thoughts return to you unbidden? What activities make you lose track of time? What subjects you can engage with for hours without fatigue? These are signals from your authentic nature. Breadcrumbs leading back to who you actually are, beneath all the layers of conditioning. But here's what makes this phase genuinely dangerous in the best sense of that word. Your authentic desires might not align with what's respectable, what's practical, what's likely to lead to conventional success. They might be strange, unmarketable, socially awkward. They might require you to abandon paths you've already invested years in pursuing. They might disappoint people whose approval you've been working to maintain. Following authentic desire has real costs, and you have to be willing to pay them, or you'll just end up back in the motivation trap, trying to force yourself toward goals that don't genuinely move you. Phase 3 is what Nietzsche calls the cultivation of instinct. Once you've identified your authentic desires, you need to rebuild your connection to your instinctive intelligence. The natural rhythms and patterns that got damaged by years of forcing and overriding and pushing through. This is not about becoming lazy or undisciplined. It's about discovering your actual natural discipline. The organic structure that emerges when you're aligned with work that genuinely calls to you. Nietzsche noticed something crucial about creative people operating at their highest level. They don't need external discipline because they have internal discipline that's infinitely more powerful. They have rhythms, they follow patterns of work and rest that suit their nature, structures they create for themselves that enable rather than constrain their productivity. But these structures are discovered, not imposed. They emerge from paying attention to how you actually function rather than trying to conform to how someone else functions or how you think you should function. This might mean you work intensely for short bursts rather than maintaining steady output over long hours. It might mean you're most creative late at night when everyone else is sleeping. It might mean you need long periods of apparent inactivity to process and integrate before you can produce. Whatever your natural pattern is, you have to discover it, respect it, build your life around it, rather than trying to force yourself into someone else's pattern and then needing motivation to sustain that unnatural configuration. Phase 4 is what Nietzsche calls the development of a more fadi love of fate. This is when you reach a state where you can embrace your entire life, including all the years you wasted seeking motivation, all the wrong paths you followed, all the mistakes you made, not because they were good or necessary or part of some plan, but because they're yours, they shaped you. They led you to this moment where transformation becomes possible. This acceptance is not resignation. It's not saying that everything happens for a reason or that your struggles were secretly blessings. It's saying that you are the product of everything that's happened to you, including all the conditioning, all the mistakes, all the time wasted, and that you can use all of that, transmute all of that, turn even the most painful experiences into fuel for what you're becoming. When you reach this state, you stop needing motivation because you've accepted that this is your life. This is your material. This is what you have to work with. And no amount of wishing it were different will change that. The final phase Nietzsche describes is the emergence of what he calls the will to power. This phrase has been so misunderstood and misused that it's almost useless now. People hear will to power and think domination, control, imposing your will on others. But that's not what Nietzsche meant at all. He meant the capacity to act from your own nature without needing external validation, external motivation, external permission. He meant becoming someone who generates their own meaning, their own values, their own direction from internal resources rather than waiting for something outside to provide them. When you reach this state, and it is reachable, though the path is different for each person, action becomes natural, again, the way it was when you were a child. Not because everything is easy, not because you never face resistance, but because the resistance comes from real obstacles in the world rather than from internal division between what you're doing and who you are. You don't need motivation to express your nature any more than a tree needs motivation to grow or a river needs motivation to flow. The action is what you are rather than something you have to force yourself to do. And here's what Nietzsche would want you to understand most clearly. You can't get to this state by consuming more motivation, by trying harder to discipline yourself, by forcing yourself more effectively. Those approaches just deepen the problem because they reinforce the fundamental split between who you are and what you're trying to do. The only path through is radical honesty about that split, ruthless examination of which goals are actually yours and which were implanted, and the courage to let go of everything that doesn't align with your authentic nature, even if that means disappointing people, abandoning prestigious paths, losing social status, or looking foolish. Think about Nietzsche again in those years when he was writing his most powerful work. No recognition, no audience, failing health, complete social isolation. If he needed external motivation, he would have given up. There was nothing outside him supporting his work, validating his effort, confirming that what he was doing mattered. But he didn't need external motivation because he had found the thing that was so aligned with his nature that doing it was simply an expression of who he was. The work itself was the motivation because there was no gap between the worker and the work. That's what's possible for you if you're willing to go through the difficult process of becoming authentic. Not a life where everything is easy, but a life where you're finally genuinely yourself, where action flows from nature rather than being forced against nature. And the paradox is that this authenticity, this alignment, produces far more actual achievement than the motivation trap ever could. Because when you're not wasting energy on internal conflict, when you're not depleting yourself trying to become someone you're not, When you're operating from your natural strengths in your natural rhythm, you become capable of things that seemed impossible when you were trying to force yourself according to someone else's template. So if you're trapped in the motivation cycle right now, if you're exhausted from constantly trying to pump yourself up to do things that don't genuinely move you, if you're beginning to suspect that maybe the problem isn't your lack of discipline, but something deeper, let me tell you what Nietzsche would say to you. Stop seeking motivation. Stop trying to fix your willpower. Stop attempting to become a more effective version of someone else's idea of success. Instead, get ruthlessly honest about what actually moves you, what genuinely calls to you, what you would do, even if nobody was watching and nobody cared and there was no reward. That thing, whatever it is, that's your path. That's where you'll find the energy that doesn't require external motivation because it comes from your own nature. That's where you'll discover discipline that doesn't feel like discipline because it's simply how you naturally operate when you're aligned with authentic work. That's where you'll access the will to power, not as something you have to develop through grinding and forcing, but as something that was always there waiting for you to stop trying to be someone else and start being yourself. And yes, this might mean letting go of goals you've been working toward for years. It might mean disappointing people whose approval you've been seeking. It might mean starting over in a direction that seems less impressive, less profitable, less respectable. But here's the truth that Nietzsche discovered and tried to communicate through everything he wrote. A single year of living authentically, of acting from genuine internal drive, of being fully yourself without apology or compromise. That 1 year will produce more real satisfaction, more actual achievement, more genuine meaning than decades of forcing yourself to pursue goals that were never yours while constantly seeking the motivation to keep doing it. The need for motivation is not your problem. It's a symptom pointing toward the real problem, which is that you're living a life that requires constant force to maintain because it's misaligned with who you actually are. Fix that misalignment, brutal as the process might be, and the motivation problem disappears. Not because you've become more disciplined, but because you've become more yourself. And being yourself doesn't require motivation any more than breathing requires motivation. It's just what you do. It's just what you are. Subscribe to the channel for more Nietzsche insights that cut through the comfortable lies of self-improvement culture and show you the truths that actually lead to transformation. If you're tired of the motivation treadmill, tired of trying to force yourself to be someone you're not, ready to do the difficult work of becoming authentic, even if that means letting go of goals and paths you've invested years in pursuing, this channel is for you. We're building a community here of people who choose truth over comfort, authenticity over success, being over seeming. Click subscribe to continue this journey toward genuine self. If you're ready to explore more about what Nietzsche discovered about authentic living, check out my video on the eternal return, where I reveal how asking one specific question can show you instantly whether you're living a life you actually want or just going through motions you've been conditioned to perform. These insights connect. The motivation trap and the eternal return are both pointing toward the same fundamental issue. The question of whether you're genuinely affirming your life or just enduring it while waiting for something outside yourself to make it meaningful. Thank you for watching. You've just spent time exploring one of the most uncomfortable truths in all of philosophy. The reality that needing constant motivation means you're fundamentally misaligned with the life you're trying to live. If this hit hard, if you recognized yourself in this examination, you're exactly the kind of person who can break free from the trap because you're willing to look at it honestly. Most people will keep consuming motivation until they die, never questioning whether the problem is the motivation or the life that requires it. The fact that you're here, that you watched to the end, that you're willing to consider that maybe you've been approaching this wrong, it tells me something important about you. It tells me you might be ready for the difficult path toward authenticity. See you in the next dimension.